everybody. I'm Jonathan Zeitlin, together with Natalie Brock. I'm organizing this monthly seminar on behalf of the standing group of the EU, on the EU of the ECPR, of which we're both members of the steering committee, along with, actually, I should say, Sarah. Today we have a presentation. The title has changed to the digital turn to public service provision to migrants and asylum seekers during COVID-19, a coordinative Europeanization approach to humanitarian duty. So you can read that on screen. Our two presenters are Sarah Wolff. She's director of the Center for European Research and reader in European politics and international relations at Queen Mary University of London. She's also principal investigator for the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence Next EU-UK project on the future of EU-UK relations. She's worked particularly on European integration, public policy, and international relations, especially on various aspects of EU-UK relations, migration, border policies, and EU relations with Islam, the Middle East, and North Africa. I think we can congratulate her on the fact that her latest book, Secular Power, Europe and Islam, Identity and Foreign Policy, from the University of Michigan Press, has just won the Best Book Award from the European Union Studies Association, USA. The paper is co-authored with Federica Zardo, who's a senior research fellow at the Danube University Krems and the Department for Migration and Globalization. She's also a lecturer at the University of Vienna. She's a political scientist. She works at the intersection between international relations and public policy with an emphasis on the EU's migration policy and external action. And we're happy we have a discussant, Leila, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Hadj-Abdou, who's a part-time assistant professor at the Migration Policy Center at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Study at the European University Institute in Florence, to which I'm also attached. And you're seeing me here in my apartment in Florence. Okay, I think that we should, without further ado, give the digital podium, let's call it that, to Federica and Sarah, and please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction, Jonathan. And thank you for the congratulating words. We are going to talk about something different today. It's not going to be Secular Power Europe, but maybe I should give a short introduction and background on how our co-authoring has come together on this project, on this publication. So I'm actually currently part of a project which is led by the Norwegian or funded by the Norwegian Research Council, which is about understanding the evolution of practices and languages on duty during the pandemic. And we have a comparative study between France, Norway, and the United Kingdom. And within that context, I started to be interested in the concept of humanitarian duty. And we had conversations with Federica. We had already worked together to look at a case study around migrants and asylum seekers. And the second, maybe short introduction I'd like to make is on the concept of coordinative Europeanization, which is also a concept that comes from a different research project that I have led with Stella Laddy. There has been 2 publications already on that, and it was the realization basically that COVID-19 has actually, and the context of permanent emergency in Europe has actually changed a little bit the nature of Europeanization, and that you have a new mode of Europeanization that has emerged, which is coordinative, in comparison to the coercive mode of Europeanization that we have seen in previous crises. And coordinative Europeanization, just to shortly summarize, is really a bottom-up process where member states are actively involved in the policy-making process early on in order to guarantee the highest level of implementation possible. Involvement is often more informal, and there is a sort of deeper understanding of interdependence between EU institutions and member states. And one of the mechanisms through which this coordinated Europeanization mechanism works is discursive coordination. So the power also of ideas and discourse in making sure that member states and EU institutions work. So this was just a little bit of context, but I think I should also leave the floor to Federica to introduce also from which perspective she's coming from, because she also brings another project to the study.
Yes, so when we discussed with Sarah this idea, I was PI of one of the work packages of an Horizon 2020 projects that just came to an end at the end of 2022, called Easy Rights, which was a coordinated and supporting action, so very operational project in the Horizon 2020 landscape, that was aimed at coordinating and co-creating ICT solutions in support for migrants and refugees integration in 4 European cities. So in the project, we had 4 pilot cities. One was the city of Birmingham, one the city of Larissa in Greece, then Palermo in Italy, and Malaga in Spain. And the main goal was either to improve or to develop directly through local activities and through hackathons that were organized during the project, some new technologies that could support the access to services of migrants and refugees in those cities, with 4 cities selecting some key services that were important and pivotal in their administration in the broader framework of migrants integration. And the project ran through fully through the pandemic. So we had the chance to really observe how the development of those services was completed despite the COVID pandemic, and what were the adjustments needed and what were the dynamics in place during COVID in order to make sure that those solutions, those digital solutions, were put in place. Great.
So this is the broader, kind of explanation of where we're coming from, what kind of project we are bringing. But this is a paper that we are preparing for a special issue on coordinative Europeanization with this case study. So it's really, really useful to have this conversation today and to get feedback. But maybe let me outline a few objectives of this specific study. And maybe later on we'll present you the insight of the paper, and we can also talk maybe about future research or ideas you may have on the direction it may take. So what we realized, and also based on the Easy Right project, but also with interviews and overall, during the pandemic, there has been, of course, a digital turn that has affected public service provision. And especially we saw some services, applications, digital tools that were developed towards migrants and refugees in all sorts of fields to improve integration on the housing front, employment, social services, but also to be able to access their statuses and to process their applications, because everything was suspended. There was no more human contact, to go to and to process, for instance, asylum applications. So we have noticed an acceleration of the adoption of these digital tools to maintain contact and continuity of public service provision. Some of these tools were actually in the pipeline already before. Some of the member states and the European Union had already in mind that digitalization of public services in general, also to citizens, not only to migrants and refugees, was a key priority. But let's say there has been really an impetus that was given by the nature of the crisis and the situation. However, in this paper, more specifically, we tie in this conversation, this example, to try to understand whether this digital turn of public services that have been accelerated in their provision to migrants and refugees is an example of coordinative Europeanization. So what I just described earlier, which is a sort of bottom-up process where there is way more coordination between member states and EU institutions, which is more informal, and that is actually works through a process of discursive Europeanization. And again, I would encourage you to read the work we've done in two different studies with two different papers with Stella Ladi, but I can also answer your questions later on. So we decided to actually pick 4 countries to compare them, France, Italy, Greece, and Spain. And already you can see that they come from different traditions. We are in an area as well when it comes to migration and asylum where it has been difficult to Europeanize overall. If you're familiar with the common European asylum system, for instance, there hasn't been many reforms since 2013. And in the field of migrant and refugee integration, it's really the member states are usually the gatekeepers. But here you see that the choices, and I think that's how we can justify also the selection of the case study, is that we have 2 countries that are quite centralized, so France and Greece, and then Italy and Spain are more decentralized, which also help to understand whether the political setting, the domestic political setting, has an impact on coordinative Europeanization through this case study. In terms of methodology, we've done so far 13 interviews, and there has been also some participant observation. So that's the objectives. Maybe in terms of context, I already said that these initiatives were not there, by magic on the day of the pandemic, but they were already in the pipelines at EU level and member states level. So there has been, here you can see, a series of declarations and strategic documents that had been developed since 2015 at EU level and very much linked to the single market strategy. And of course, now we speak about digital Europe. It has really taken up a different shape with the pandemic and was one of the leading initiatives of the President von der Leyen, and also explained in her State of Union declarations. But we see quite interestingly that COVID-19 has actually led to an evolution of the discourse at EU level, where you have a linkage that has happened between developing inclusive digital services to provide EU fundamental, or to provide continuity of public service provisions, but also ensure EU fundamental rights and duties for citizens, but also for migrants and refugees. So that's an evolution, because I think before that, the discourse at EU level on humanitarian duty and maybe more solidarity was mostly linked to or directed to member states, but here there is an evolution towards individual citizens, and to some extent in our field to migrants and refugees, even though it's debated as well and contested, but we will talk about this. What is interesting also is that most of these initiatives in the case study that we developed have not only been accelerated, but have also been part of the implementation of the decisions taken during COVID-19. And I'm thinking about the RFF, the Resilience and Recovery Fund that has been implemented at national level. However, overall, why we find this research interesting, because there is little knowledge actually, or little understanding on what is the nature of the interaction between the EU and its member states in that field. It's also interesting because, as I said before, when it comes to competencies in the field of migration and asylum, there is I think a resurgence overall of renationalization and quite centralized competencies as well, and a very top-down Europeanization process in different areas of migration and asylum. So I think our main contribution to the field, at least of Europeanization and coordinative Europeanization, is also to bring a perspective of also the subnational level, because as we will discuss, these digital tools have not been only developed by member states in a very centralized way, but sometimes with more subnational actors, especially in countries like Spain and Italy, and also with civil society organization, which is also a new element to understand how the digital turn has taken shape. Yes, in terms of approach that is taken in the paper, we look at the process of discourse. I think the case has already been made in the literature on Europeanization, that discourse can be a powerful tool to frame strategically, of course, your objective, but also that within the domestic or subnational level, actors can also mobilize and strategically use Europe to achieve their own objectives, or to find sometimes some legitimacy to their actions. And we will give you a few examples later on, but we had in our interviews, Europe was really mobilized also in the discourse by some actors to sometimes even bypass actually the national level and to be able to move on in their digitalization, which was quite interesting. However, we also know from the literature that when you look at discourse, it can have different meanings for different actors. It's not a static, analysis. It's quite, it's quite dynamic. It can be, meanings can be contested. You have interaction. And actually, Claudio Radaeli has also written that this is particularly the case, and where discourse is quite interesting to use to understand Europeanization in areas where actually there is not necessarily a big consensus on EU action, which is the case, I think, when it comes to migration and asylum. So we focus on the persuasive power of ideas. We also borrow from Vivian Schmidt and her work on discursive institutionalism, which helps to explain how policy change happens. And of course, you have two elements to it. The coordinative discourse, so it's more how EU institutions or would legitimize and communicate their needs to develop digital tools in the field of migration and asylum. And then you have the communicative discourse, which I think is interesting, is how then the institution communicated to its audience, to its other multi-level stakeholders. But I think our added value here is actually to look at discourse also as a practice by subnational actors who are able to influence it and to co-constitute the discourse through their own bottom-up, let's say, contributions. Maybe also you might wonder why the concept of humanitarian duty and what does it mean in our research? Why is it important? So again, I explained where I was coming from, and at the moment I'm working on how COVID-19 has impacted the language of duty at different levels in different countries. And I think there are lots of different interesting research on how it's being mobilized by institutions to ask us to stay home, to wash our hands, to be good citizens overall. But again, I don't think we know much about what happened towards migrants and refugees. So here you have a little bit of context also on this discourse and how it has evolved. So before, I think, and I forgot to say that one of the key concepts of coordinative Europeanization is also inter-crisis learning. So it's also important to look at what happened before. And since 2015, actually, the discourse on humanitarian duty has been mobilized by EU institutions to legitimize and justify the expansion of its competencies in rescue at sea, particularly at the time of the Syrian crisis. You might remember there were debates about revising the mandate of Frontex, which became actually evolved from a European border agency to a European border and coast guard agency. And there has been, there is evidence of this discourse being mobilized. You might find it under terms such as duty to protect or duty of care and rescue as well in the literature. Overall, the literature and migration scholars also see that this concept can also sometimes go against the rights, I would say, or of migrants and refugees, that they're not always inclusive, that they can be discriminatory, especially if you look at algorithm, biometrics, and of course there is the whole literature about surveillance, which is very important. So I think the role of digital tools within the space of humanitarian duty discourse in migration and refugees is contested. Especially it's interesting to see that during the pandemic, there has been also a discourse seeing refugees and migrants as corona spreaders. I don't like very much the term, but you saw it in the debates, and an increase of deterrence in the Mediterranean. And actually the humanitarian, in a way, states have tried, at least around the Mediterranean, to escape their duties towards refugees, so-called humanitarian or cosmopolitan duties, which I think is a little bit the context within which we look at discursive coordination. I wanted also to add another aspect of the whole debate. Maybe it's too much in this paper, but I found it interesting also that when we speak about migration and asylum seekers coming to Europe, it has been increasingly a digitalized in many ways. And some research also speak about, and I'm quoting Gillespie and all, they say the passage to Europe is a socio-technical, embodied and imaginative process comprising fears and hopes for a new life, but it is a digital passage to Europe because you have migrants and refugees using apps, and social networks. You have the smugglers who might actually identify also, potential victims as well, or clients. I don't know how to phrase it via these tools. And you have also the whole border and law enforcement dimension, which also use these digital tools. But again, I think it's quite interesting to look at discourse and how it's being mobilized. Now, in terms of, so I mentioned earlier the importance to look also at the discourse, how it is being communicated by EU institutions. So in the paper, we've analyzed some of the official discourse of EU institutions, especially the European Commission, commissioners, when it comes to discourse, and how the pandemic has affected it. So you have an action plan on integration and inclusion that had a clear focus on duty. You had Commissioner Shinas, who is in charge of, I think it's called protecting our European way of life, which was already polemic at the time, but he really highlights as well in different declarations the importance of inclusion being both a right and a duty for all. So really the normative dimension of the duty discourse being mobilized by EU institutions. And I think, again, as I mentioned before, what is interesting is that discourse of duty was in prior crises of so-called crisis of migration and refugees was mobilized towards the member states. So you might remember the relocation conversation or discussion about asking EU member states to relocate some Syrian refugees from Greece and Italy to other EU member states. It's not been particularly successful as a strategy for different reasons. You had a discourse also on solidarity then, but here with the pandemic, you see a shift from an evolution, let's say, of this duty discourse not being targeting and talking to only EU member states, but actually to everyone, to citizens. And I think you see it also, you know, it's quite an interesting shift. You see it also when we think about the Ukraine crisis or about the energy crisis. It's about individuals staying at home, washing their hands, or closing, you know, putting the heating down, or, you know, or opening their doors to welcome Ukrainian refugees. So it's quite an interesting shift from before and from EU institutions, I would say, addressing and targeting everyone in a more, citizens in Europe. Yes, and you see also in the different plans and strategy still that these digital tools should be mobilized to modernize access to services, create partnerships in co-creation with citizens, so mostly often organized in civil society organizations, and that they want to have more human-centric digital tools, and that everything, this duty discourse should serve a greater good cause, which is not up to just EU member states, but also individuals. And I think I will pass on the floor to Federica.
Yes. As Sarah said before, we compared 4 cases, France, Greece, Italy, and Spain, merging in a way the available cases that we had in our 2 respective projects. We compare, we see that different dynamics are at play here. So in France and Greece, we have not only we have 2 countries where with a centralized system of the governance of integration, but where the levels of digitalization of the administrations were different. So with a medium to high level of digitalization in France to a quite low level of digitalization in Greece. So for instance, in the case of France, we saw that digitalization plans and strategies were already there, targeting migrants and refugees were already there before the start of the pandemic, because in 2018, a prefect was nominated to lead an interministerial delegation for welcoming and integrating refugees. And we saw, interestingly, that in the letter for the nomination of this prefect, the discourse really mobilizes Europe as a legitimizing strategy. So where the letter mentions that the integration of refugees is one of the main challenges that the French government is trying to overcome, and in a direction that wants to place France as a leading actor in Europe and in line with EU strategies. And this is backed by a strong discourse around duty, where we saw many times reflected in the documents and in our interviews that France must meet the appointments with integration that Europe launched. And this should be done by everyone, by local administrations and service providers. So a plan was already there and started being remobilized or accelerated at the start of the pandemic, with the strong mobilization of the European discourse on duty towards migrants and refugees. The level of digitalization of public services in Greece was seen since the beginning, at the onset of the pandemic, as one of the main challenges in Greece. And we saw that the pandemic gave the possibility to Greece to embed digitalizations in broader European digitalization strategies. So the integration of the so-called Greek digital Bible, this is how the Greek digital strategy is called, into the National Resilience and Recovery Plan, activated a plan that had been on the table for years, but could not be but that could not be really implemented in any way, with the objective then to implement the digital by default mode by 2023. So despite those two different starting points, we saw that on the one hand, in France, we had a strong acceleration of all the activities at the beginning of 2020, of course, triggered by COVID, where the youth discourse was important for the central government to coordinate and group together the local initiatives, because what we saw is that although the central government reactivated the strategy, there were a lot of local initiatives at the subnational and even sublocal level. And here, when we talk about sublocal, we talk about small projects led by NGOs and sublocal actors. And the youth discourse was useful for the government to justify the fact that the main platform for refugees and migrants, the digital platform for refugees and migrants integration, that would have been from that moment on the reference tool for providing information and providing services to migrant integration, would have been the one launched by the interministerial delegation. But the discourse on duty and the reference to the EU was useful to coordinate and keep together all those local initiatives, not to avoid dispersion, to ensure sustainability, and to accelerate the implementation of this platform. In the same way, also local actors were important were present in the governance of integration, of migration and integration in Greece, and we saw that the central government in Greece started calling for a duty to act together vis-a-vis local administrations in order to keep together and then make the most of the local initiatives, but in a certain way direct top-down the digitalization of services for migrants and refugees. We saw during the Easy Rights project that we had a moment of stalemate at the beginning of 2020, when the first hackathons and activities for co-creation of digital solutions, when they had to be launched. We saw a moment of stalemate because there was no support by the national government. And then, as soon as the Greek Digital Bible was embedded in the broader national resilience and recovery plan, clear instructions were given to local authorities in order to speed up the implementation of digital tools for migrants and refugees. And in those guidelines, a strong discourse about the role that local public authorities could play in implementing the Greek Digital Bible was particularly strong, and a strong reference about the fact that all Europe was going in the same direction. So in a way, in the French and Greek case, we see that this also that the local and subnational level also mobilize itself, the discourse on civic duties, in order to overcome the bottlenecks that the centralized process often created. Because as I said, for a few months, the whole system was blocked and subnational authorities couldn't do much, but they tried to support each other and support then the target groups, so migrants and refugees, by calling for a duty to protect, a duty to create, to integrate, a duty to be inclusive. In the case of Spain and Italy, we see a completely different trajectory of Europeanization. Also in this case, we see different levels, points of departures, different level of digitalizations in the two countries, a medium to high level in Spain, depending on the cities. We see a lot of territorial differences throughout Spain in this respect, and quite low in Italy. And in both cases, on the other hand, we see a quite decentralized system of integration of migrants and refugees, being it formal or informal, but a decentralized system. In Spain and Italy, what we saw is that subnational and sub-local levels of government really assumed the leadership role in digitalizing digitalization initiatives for vulnerable groups, in particular migrants and refugees. Initially, they were overwhelmed by additional responsibilities during the early phases of the pandemic, as it was the case throughout Europe. And subnational authorities really strongly mobilized the concept of duty and solidarity. So in many cases, we had many interviews and observations where the main call at the beginning of meetings to activate those hackathons were about, we have a duty to act together, Europe is going in this direction, we are all in the same boat, and we have to try to digitalize to improve inclusion. So we see the same discourse that was mobilized by subnational authorities in the two countries, and sublocal actors. In those cases, the European Union, of course, was not only mobilized to legitimize the actions, but also to financially back the activities, because all the local initiatives that we saw were funded by the European Union through either Horizon 2020 or the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund or the Regional Development Fund. So those activities were backing local actions, and the guiding documents were contributing to build the discourse that then was spread throughout the local authorities. So many of the keywords that were used in those programming documents that are rather operational then feeded the discourses that were used to coordinate workers and civil society organizations to speed up the process of digitalization of public services. In those cases, we also saw a lot of informal coordination that took place, and a lot of a lot of learning practices, because subnational actors relied a lot on sharing good practices either through within the country or with countries outside of or with countries outside of Europe, outside of the country. So with some tandems between local authorities within the country or outside, and in some cases, some informal fora for dialogue were created exactly to coordinate first the local level, and then to make sure that initiatives at the local level could reach the national level to then push the national level to speed up digitalization at the level of the whole country. So, for example, some platforms were informally created in Italy, connecting together all the municipal councillors in charge of delivering public services, or, for example, in Spain, a body called the Social Councils of the City of Malaga, which was inactive for a long time, was reactivated in order exactly to coordinate all the local actors and then coordinate with the regional first and then national level. So to conclude and then link to the very first, to the framework that Sarah described before, it's interesting to see is that first we really saw discursive coordination at play in all the 4 localities, in Paris, in Palermo, Malaga, and Larissa. So we see coordinated Europeanization at play, but with different trajectories. So the trajectory was more from the national to the local in Paris and Larissa, with a discourse on duty that was mobilized to legitimize the recentralization efforts that were at play during the crisis and as a response to the crisis. While the trajectory that we see in Spain and Italy was rather from the local to the national and then up to the European, with sometimes local authorities try to bypass the stalemates at the national level to be backed in their initiatives by the European Union. And the discourse on humanitarian duty that was really supporting the borrowing of experiences and practices from somewhere else, being other cities in the same countries or in another European countries, or to compensate for missing resources and competencies, because that was also the case. The fact that sublocal and subnational authorities took the lead, also created some black holes in terms of competencies that were needed to really provide effective digital tools. In all the cases, the European Union served as a legitimizing actors in discourse and through discourse, but also through funding, of course. And in all the cases observed, we saw a strong push for a discourse on interdependence that really permeates all the initiatives, irrespective of the level of digitalization through the country or the governance system, so centralized and decentralized. So I stop it here, and we thank in advance everyone for suggestions, because this is a project which is really ongoing. We're still conducting interviews and trying to expand our knowledge on the different cases. So every comment will be more than welcome.
And maybe I stop the sharing.
Okay, thanks. Why don't you stop sharing your screen, and then we turn over to Leila as the discussant.
Yeah, and the second ironic point is also that I'm sitting in a subnational city office, which deals with migration, and this is where the digital issue happens. So this is, I find it also quite the learning experience. But thanks so much to Federica and Sarah for this paper. I think it has lots of rich material in it, but I would like to just suggest how you can more structure it a little bit more to flesh out really all the richness you can do with this paper. So for the one thing, what I thought when reading it is that you focus on the discourses, right? And on the discourse on human duty, how the digitalization is mobilized and brought forward by this narrative, so to say. And I found this interesting because when you think about migration control narratives, right, there you also have a very moralistic language, which is about values, but then in the end it's about surveillance. Here, if I understand well, the narrative of human duty is also to act as a service provider to help vulnerable groups. And I think this is also where it connects, that I think what the paper should do more to make clear what the role of digitalization is. Who uses it, for what reasons, in terms of, is it about migrant integration? Is it about really guiding these vulnerable groups during COVID? So this wasn't really clear when reading the paper. And I think, especially since you look at the subnational level, right? And the cities who are often service providers, I think you should make that clear and also focus on these terms of service provision. So this is one point I had in mind, given also which type of localities you select. And also in terms of the localities you select, and you want to explain Europeanization and digitalization, for me it also would make sense to explain more, or to have a more comparative method, in the sense that now was still, I think you could strengthen it a little bit, saying why these cases and why these cases help you to understand digitalization. So you mentioned that some of them are more centralized. You mentioned the role of the subnational levels as leaders, but I think you could also formulate several expectations, what you expect to find according to these countries and subnational localities. Also, is it more a top-down digitalization or a bottom-up? Because in some instances, you also mention like more individual or migrant actor centered digitalization and apps. So I think this is also something to take into account, to formulate some expectations why you would see some differences. Also, what you mentioned is another thing, is about the so also another thing what is about the learning from each other. So this is another issue like I want to hear more and learn more about, and I believe there is very rich data you have on this, but it needs to be teased out more in the paper. So do these cities also learn from each other, or is it the learning across the nation states? and what's the role of Europe in this sense? Is it always intervening when they learn from each other, or is it, so who steers this learning across the localities? And I think also when I thought about my own example now, being in a city authority who deals with migrants, it's also, I think, one part of the explanation is how is digital support and digitalization managed? So is it centralized within these localities, or have these migration agencies their own power to exercise digital programs? So I think this really makes a big difference. Another thing is also with the relationship with the state, when the local level or subnational level implement national policies, are they then able to have their own digital programs, or is it steered by the nation state? I think this also explains a lot. Then you mentioned also in terms of the funding mechanisms. And I think this is a really nice example, which you really could strengthen much, much more. This soft Europeanization through this funding means that you have really, you push these different localities towards the very same goals through the funding in a very soft way, that they then, we see a soft convergence, so to say. I think teasing this out, what funding really means, and compare this in terms of outcomes, I think would also be a path to go about. I also want to hear more about the outcomes of this digitalization, because when I really think, okay, you look now at Europeanization, but I think we shouldn't forget, and you should link your paper to all the big debates about digitalization, namely the digital divide. How is this taken into account, right? When digitalization happens? What about gender dimensions, but other terms of especially when it comes to vulnerable groups, about their access? So I think these are questions that need to be teased out more. About then also another thing is also, what about then the temporality? Of course, COVID accelerated all of this, but what I see from my own experience, that there is now going back much more, because also the narrative is about human duty, and there is very much the human in the focus, but in the one sense, digitalization can be also very dehumanizing, especially for migrants on the move, right, who want the social networks, who want the contact. So what we see very much also in my own daily work is really the form of going back and scaling back the digitalization that was already adopted during COVID. So I think these are some, let me think. Yeah, the soft I mentioned. Yeah, so these are just some of the points that I had. I'm happy to discuss more about, let me also hear what you think about these different points. Yeah, I leave it here now, because also I hope it was clear despite my digital problems.
Digital problems seem to have been fully overcome. So before I give the presenters a chance to respond, I thought I might add a comment of my own, and then Sarah and Federica, I'll give you a chance to respond, then we'll open up to Q&A with the audience. And it will be possible for people in the audience to put on their cameras and unmute and ask their questions directly. If you're not in a public place and you can't do that, you can put your questions in the chat. I see Stefania wants to come in. I'll come to you shortly. So Sarah and Federica, I wanted to take up the conceptual question of coordinative Europeanization. And I have to say this raises two puzzles for me. One puzzle is the question, especially if you emphasize the discursive dimension of coordination, and perhaps the availability of some funding, which might help to support voluntary convergence by member state actors around common objectives or approaches. So my question would be, in what sense is this new? And as you probably know, I mean, I started out 20 years ago studying the open method of coordination, followed it through the Lisbon strategy and the Europe 2020 strategy, and that would have been many of the central features that people would have used to talk about, you know, at least one set of channels through which policy coordination mechanisms like the open method of coordination work. It's obviously, you know, very different than at the other extreme, you know, the economic adjustment programs and memoranda of understanding imposed on member states who received bailouts during the Euro crisis, which certainly could be called coercive Europeanization in a certain sense, or even the aspiration of the Stability and Growth Pact to push member states strongly in a common direction based on the threat of sanctions, even if those sanctions have not and probably never will be actually implemented. So that's the first question. I mean, why should we think of this as something new? What's different from what you're talking about than the kinds of phenomena that we've been studying for more than 20 years under this kind of heading? And the second is, and this is perhaps a little bit more oblique to the topic, or to today's topic, but I am puzzled why you would think, or why you and Stella Lottie think that the Recovery and Resilience Facility of the Next Generation EU is really an example of coordinative Europeanization. And here, I should say that you know, I'm leading a big study of the governance of the RRF in 8 member states, and so I've spent some time trying to understand what is the governance model of the RRF, also as the EU institutions define it. And I would say it has 3 components. This is even the language they use. It's demand-driven, so it's based on plans that are formulated by member states, but in close dialogue with the European Commission, which also can insist on some features. Secondly, it's incentive supported, so there are positive financial incentives of a very large and strong character, perhaps stronger than the kind that you are talking about in today's presentation. And thirdly, and this is the biggest difference probably, is that it is also performance-based. So the payouts are based on the fulfillment of so-called targets and milestones, which are very precisely defined down to the kind of verifying documents that are required, and these are tied to the approval of payment requests by the member states, which you know then also have to go through the council. And so you know, I see, of course, that you know there is these new elements in the RRF, which are you know, that the plans are really drawn up by member states in the first instance, even if they have to meet some criteria set by the Commission. And secondly, that there's financial support rather than negative sanctions. But this really looks very different from your discursive coordination. I don't think that discourses are the main factor working here, and it's not at all informal. It's highly formalized. Indeed, one of the problems is that the assessment of fulfillment of milestones and targets is becoming very bureaucratized. So, you know, perhaps since I think you are interested in the conceptual dimension, you might want to respond to that. In the interest of time, maybe we also take the question from Stefania because she has her hand up. She's obviously burning to ask her question or give her comment. So maybe we take that. It's a pity we lost Sotirios Zardo, who I'm sure would have had something interesting to say. Stefania.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. It's a pleasure to be here and to listen to this research presentation by Federica and Sarah, and I thank you very much for having jumped into the discourse and research on migration and humanitarian duties with your contribution, your research. I have three comments, basically. One comes from what I have had. I apologize, I was teaching and then I lost the first 5 minutes. Then probably I did not grasp correctly the goal of your research, and therefore I will skip the first part of the title and I will focus more on the second part of the research, coordinative Europeanization approach of humanitarian duty. My question then on humanitarian duty is how are you conceptualizing and defining humanitarian duty at EU level? Because if we look at the way how humanitarian duty is conceived, for example, at the level of supranational institutions, and I have in mind the European Commission, but I might mention even Federica Mogherini when she was High Commissioner of Foreign Policy, we have a definition and a commitment towards humanitarian duty. If we move towards other institutional, EU institutional levels, and I have in mind the European Council and I have in mind single EU member states, probably we have a different definition of humanitarian duty. Then my question is, which is the level of analysis, institutional level of analysis? What I have in mind, for example, is the fact that if we look at what has happened in Italy recently, there has been a change of sense-making of, for example, you were mentioning the search and rescue operations, maritime operations. We have assisted at a change, a completely change of political definition of maritime operations from humanitarian duty to intervene to a sort of non-ingerence in the control of the Mediterranean Sea when there is the Libyan Coast Guard that has the duty to intervene. Of course, I am using the brackets, okay? If you look at the data, we see that the Italian Coast Guard interventions have reduced drastically in the last 10 years. And then we pass from a humanitarian duty to intervene, to rescue migrants in distress at sea, to a delegation of maritime operations to the partners, the third countries and Libyan Coast Guard. Then the level of institutional analysis is my first question. And the second question, in a way, you know that I am very much interested in discursive institutionalism, of course. The first question relates to a different interaction. You were mentioning that you have tested and confirmed discursive combination in these four countries and these four towns, Paris, Palermo, Malaga, and Larissa. And I was wondering, who is your target? And you conducted 13 interviews, but who have you conducted? Who have you interviewed? What kind of interviews have you conducted? Because if we have interviews, for example, in the peripheries, we might have a different commitment and definition and sense of duty to intervene, while if we look at national level, I have again in mind the Italian case, we might have a different conception of this humanitarian intervention and humanitarian duty to intervene. And these kind of decoupling senses in the Italian case are clearly detected by empirical research. What happens in Syracuse is definitely not what is let's say, wished and welcome by national levels. We have a clear decoupling stance. If we have the central government that is not really inclined in sending Italian Coast Guard, as we saw in Cudro, and then locally we have another attitude. And the last comment, it's not actually a question, but rather a comment. If we look at the role that vulnerables have in the discourse of the European Union, we see that vulnerability is not any longer a prominent dimension of what the European Union is seeking and welcoming. We have recently conducted a discourse analysis that has taken into account 25 years, 95 or 2020, and we have moved further than the European agenda of migration, or rather the new pact on asylum and migration, to include even other documents. And there clearly is a gap between what the European says and what the European does, and the kind of policy tools the European Union adopts. And the vulnerability, rather than humanitarian assistance, have a very minor place, rather than combating organized crime, combating illegal migration, and even policy tools such as readmissions, returns are priorities in the EU policy tools agenda. Thank you so much for your kind presentation.
Thanks, Stefania. Okay, Sarah and Federica, would you like to respond to these actually 3 sets of comments and questions that you've received? And other people who are still in the audience, if you would like to ask a question, why don't you put up your hand and I'll come to you after this first round of responses. Stefania, maybe you can put your virtual hand down.
Okay.
You start?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So maybe I start. So I will address some questions by Leila, and some questions by Stefania. Will then hand up to Sarah for Jonathan's question, which is more on the conceptual component. So first of all, thank you very much, Leila, for the comments. I guess that there's still a lot in our data in our heads that is not in the paper, and there is something that is in the paper but has to be systematized based on what we have in our heads. So that's an ongoing process, but it's extremely useful. So for sure, the comparative component has to be highlighted. We tried a little bit in the presentation to take already a step further compared to what we did in the paper that you received, but we have to strengthen that in terms of expectations and hypotheses, because we had some expectations, especially regarding the differences in the level of centralizations between the 2 groups of cities and countries then, so Greece and France and Spain and Italy. But we have to clarify that, and especially about the learning from each other, because, for example, what we saw is that we saw a lot of learning across at the subnational and sublocal level when it comes to learning from other governmental initiatives and between central governments, that we see very well in a more limited way. So we saw that this dynamics of intra-crisis learning was definitely more present when subnational actors took the lead of digitalization initiatives, and not when central government took the lead. In that case, the tandem was more between the EU and the government, rather than the EU, the government, and then other potential central governments that were driving similar initiatives across Europe. And then this can matched with some expectations that we had. You raised an interesting point about temporality that we should clarify, because what we saw is that while there is a step back in some practices in service provision after the peak of the pandemic, the digital component is harder to take back. So especially in many cases, when we ask the question whether and to what extent then the practices had become structural in a way, when it comes to digitalization and the relationship between users and service providers, although there is a full reflection about the possible exclusionary dynamics that digitalization might generate, the solutions were rather coping mechanisms, or rather side projects that could compensate for this exclusionary dynamics. So additional courses on digital literacy, for instance, both for service providers and for the target groups, but not necessarily a step back. While in other cases, because in the Easy Rights project, for example, we observed also some services that were not only digitalized, because some of the providers were also providing more basic services. Then in that case, the practices that were activated during the crisis, the coping practices, then came back to normal when the peak of the pandemic was overcome. But in the case of digital tools, we didn't see that. But we expected that. But the reality actually contradicted a bit what we saw. So it's interesting probably to talk about this dimension. The question about, well, soft Europeanization through funding, definitely we should highlight that, because that's something that we haven't stressed enough. Concerning a question by Stefania about interviews, we are conducting interviews at both levels, so at the national level and at the municipal level. Here we're talking, so for example, for the cases of Malaga, Palermo, Larissa, and Paris, we're talking about local authorities at the municipal level, or NGOs and sublocal actors acting in the city. So either the job seeking service of the city of Palermo, the social service department of the city, and so on and so forth, and comparing that with, of course, then the interviews that we are conducting at the national level. So for Italy, for example, also the Ministry of Labor that is in charge of this platform that is still very basic at the national level for the integration of migrants. So we are trying to compare the discourses between the two. It's true that, and we should probably highlight that in the definition, that the discourses are the same in the sense that are mobilizing the sense of duty, but there are some nuances in the way duty is defined by the local and or by the subnational and by the central level. But we're trying to, of course, we started from the municipal level, so the local level, because we're exploring service providers which were municipal authorities and local service providers, but then we took another step and set up interviews also with the national levels in the different countries observed, exactly to try to match this to the findings and see where the discourse were aligned and where the discourse were not aligned, and rather taking another direction or have another meaning. I leave then the floor to Sarah so that she can take.
And sorry, I have to apologize. I had to escape for a minute. We are in the middle of a demonstration in France against the pension law that has been forced through by President Macron. So I had to escape and to manage the emergency of demonstrations, but it should be fine. So I hope I got the questions right because I missed part of it. But from what I understand, and to thank Leila for all her comments that I have noted down. I think these are very important elements to think about, the comparative methods, what we expect to find in terms of digitalization, and I think in justifying the case studies and why these different countries matter, I think. And of course, I think the most important thing for me is, as you said, compared to, and I think Stefania also mentioned this discourse, who are you studying, what level of institutional analysis, because I think as migration scholars, we are used to a humanitarian discourse that is not, that has been instrumentalized or strategically framed to legitimize more restrictive approaches of law enforcement. So I think what we could clarify, and maybe it answers also Stefania's question, is, what is in terms of interviewees, so mostly we've been interviewing people who have been involved in the development of these digital tools at the subnational level. So maybe this could be clarified from the onset, because I think it's a different crowd, let's say, in terms of co-constituting the humanitarian duty. And I mean, I don't think we will demonstrate that they can change the EU level discourse, but at least that it has maybe a different meaning at the subnational level, which could be interesting. So I think it's a matter of clarification, because this is really our target. We were wondering about having interviews in Brussels, actually, to kind of confront the communicative discourse of the EU and how it is received, maybe contested and co-constituted by the subnational level. So that's something really interesting to speak about. But I think, Jonathan, you had a question about coordinative Europeanization. What's new about the concept? I think maybe also something we haven't, so this paper is part of a special issue on that concept, but maybe I should have from the outset clarified that it doesn't mean that because we come with coordinative Europeanization that it cannot coexist with other modes of Europeanization. So coercive or more soft modes of Europeanization could still coexist. But I think it's really the reflexive or the reflex to coordinate that seems to be more institutionalized than before, and it's not necessarily coercive. If we think about the austerity measures and the financial crisis, that is more top down, and that's why the RFF are interesting, because I think there is, but again, I'm not an expert, so I'm happy to have the conversation. I think there has been the drafting of national recovery plans that have been adopted, and that it seems that the dialogue and the realization that there needs to be coordination because of the interdependence between EU level and member states level is different than before. And I think that's where we put the emphasis. And also, I think the element of permanent emergency, which makes this coordinative reflex more natural, more institutionalized, but sometimes also more informal. Yes, in the first papers, I remember we give the example of the capital commission networks that had developed at the time of the pandemic. So I think it's also the high capacity whenever there is a decision to be made to consult, to coordinate more quickly. And sometimes it doesn't mean that we come up with new solutions, but it accelerates the adoption of prior solutions that were there. So I think that's my answer. I'm not sure if it's entirely convincing, but it's how to design policy solutions together as well. And I think our study here on top of everything also adds up the subnational element to this mode of coordinative Europeanization.
Thanks. That would be a much longer discussion about what you would really need to do to make this a robust concept that could, let's say, fly and travel across different areas and take its place in the broader debate about different modes of EU governance and Europeanization. Is there anyone else in the audience who would like to ask a question or make a comment? I think if not, it just is left to me to thank the presenters and the discussants and the other members of the audience. I should say that Natalie had warned me that she would have to leave early for another engagement, so that was not for lack of any interest. Okay, so our next session is going to be on the 20th of April. The speakers are William Daniel and Andrea Aldrich, with Johanna Cantola as the discussant, and the title is Contagion, Socialization, or Kinship, Quotas and Gendered Career Differences in Transnational European Party Families. So it's a very different kind of topic, although I think one where discourse and contestation of discourse will probably be very central as well. Okay, thanks to everybody, and maybe see some of you next month.